Good morning, good morning, good morning, and welcome to the Justice Beat Talk Show. We're back for another episode, and we're so happy that you have joined us. This morning, we have with us Ms. Gwen Smith, Criminal Justice Policy Manager with Empower Missouri. Welcome, Gwen.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
Glad to have you. Glad to have you. Ready to have this conversation, this discussion about public policies that promote or impede successful reentry. And today's guest interviewer is Lainey Perez. She is our associate producer who was responsible for the build out of this episode. As I've said in the past, this season we did something new. I am no longer centered in the show as the guest interviewer. Students from Adler University are now interviewing all of our guests. So I'm going to sneak out, evaluate and monitor on the back end, and I'll see you at the 10:45 mark for our Q&A. Take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Elaine. And welcome, Gwen. It's nice to see you.
Great to see you. Great to meet you in person.
Right. It's good to put a face to a name.
Definitely.
Awesome. So let's get into it. So as Elaine mentioned, you work for Empower Missouri. So what is Empower Missouri?
So Empower Missouri is an anti-poverty focused policy organization. We're actually one of the longest serving nonprofits in Missouri. We were founded back in 1901 and were originally the Missouri Conference on Charities and Corrections. So we've always had a really strong criminal legal focus. And over our 120-year history, we've gone through a lot of iterations, obviously, in that time, but we were a big part in the creation of the Missouri Commission on Human Rights, establishing a public defender system in our state, the Children's Hunger Relief Act. Those are, some of the things that we worked on in a lot of the 20th century, and then recent wins, especially in the criminal legal space, been around raise the age legislation, changes to the expungement process that were made a couple years ago. But we definitely have our work cut out for us. There are a lot of issues in Missouri that hold people back, hold families back. And Empower Missouri really focuses on an anti-poverty lens through the criminal legal system. And then our other coalition focus areas are in affordable housing and food security. So in those kind of three different policy focuses, we try to work with folks from all over the state, mobilizing individuals, mobilizing direct service organizations to come together and advocate for and against policies in Jefferson City.
Awesome. So it sounds like you've had it from the beginning. You're just going through it. And so that's awesome. That's awesome to be able to hear that Empower Missouri has been around since, like you said, 1901. And so for the types of reentry that you were talking about, is it just for poverty, for individuals living in poverty, or is that can it go for incarcerated individuals who have been struggling with drug or alcohol?
Oh, absolutely. So in the Community Justice Coalition, which we kind of rebranded and renamed our Criminal Justice Coalition towards the end of last summer as the Community Justice Coalition, to try to, be in line with kind of positive verbiage around talking about the criminal legal system, which you'll notice I also kind of shift my language in talking about, criminal justice is a term that we're all really familiar with. And because we know our system does not deliver justice for many, I've kind of tried to shift my own language, and that's why you'll hear me saying criminal legal system. But in the Community Justice Coalition, we really focus on the 5 different phases of the criminal legal system: policing, pretrial supervision, trial, incarceration, and reentry. There's, policy changes that can be made at all of those different intersections of the system that are really going to impact folks coming out, impact folks, trying to divert them from going into the system and having to be incarcerated in jail or prison to begin with. So there's a lot of different areas, and kind of points of intervention. And in terms of, who we are fighting for, I mean, everybody's been impacted by the criminal legal system, whether, they themselves have a record or have been incarcerated, they have a loved one, it impacts, our communities heavily. It's holding everybody back. The collateral consequences that folks face when they're getting out and when they're struggling with that record, that we know can really hold people back in significant ways. And I'll talk a lot about some of the exciting policy solutions that we see for helping people, fully re-enter the fold after a sentence or after, having a charge. And so we have a lot of community advocates that are involved in the coalition, that are directly impacted, that have been incarcerated, that have loved ones that are currently incarcerated. I think, can't understate the importance of those experiences and those, individuals really being centered in this work and guiding this work. And you mentioned, recovery. The recovery community is such a big part of our coalition and a lot of our campaign work. People in the substance abuse field, are working inside of correctional facilities. They're working in a lot of transitional living centers. A lot of, folks have justice involvement themselves. And so that's a really important part of our advocacy base.
Awesome. I do really enjoy how you used, what was it? The criminal something system instead of the criminal justice system.
The criminal legal system, which, it feels like we're splitting hairs sometimes, but I also think that language is always important. And especially when, you're talking about such an oppressive system, and that the language, is very important. I have meetings sometimes with DOC, and they call everybody in a Missouri facility offenders, and it paints a really clear picture of the stance that somebody's taking. So I think language, using people first language really matters, and trying to call things what they are. And so that's one of the reasons that we still, we like the verbiage of justice, because that's what we're ultimately fighting for. But I think criminal legal system, we've made that shift just to not paint our own opinions on the criminal legal system, and kind of, to say it like it is.
That makes sense. That really does. And again, overarching goal, justice. But again, we're not there yet. So we're working towards that. And so in what ways do you incorporate your position as the criminal justice policy manager into all or just many of the aspects of Empower Missouri?
Yeah, so I joined the team at Empower almost a year ago. I joined the team last June. And so my first year has really been kind of like getting up to speed. It's my first role in a policy space. My background is more in direct service social work and kind of program management. And so, a lot of my day-to-day is like meeting with folks in the community. Obviously a lot of Zoom meetings given, the world that we live in, but also because our work is state-based, and I'm based in St. Louis, I'm able to connect with advocates, with direct service providers from all over the state, and hear, what they're seeing on the ground, what policy issues they're really interested in. We really try to use that to inform our policy priorities. We're not just, creating policy priorities out of a vacuum, but really trying to make sure that they're very much tied in with the reality that people are experiencing in our state. And so I do a lot of meeting with folks. We have monthly coalition meetings outside of legislative session. So in Missouri, our session runs from January through May. So we're kind of getting towards the end of our session right now. During that time, we meet as a coalition twice a month. The rest of the year, we meet once a month, and we've got working groups of coalition members that kind of dig deeper on some of our key policy priority areas. And I'm working a lot with my other colleagues, with the policy managers, especially in affordable housing and food security, because there's so many overlaps between all of those issues, which, Empower Missouri, like I said, we're just focused on anything that's anti-poverty policy in Missouri. And those are just kind of the three key areas. But we know that, issues of reentry are affordable housing issues, are, about access to food and to employment. So all of those things are very interlinked. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, for sure. And so you said that you do meetings and Zoom meetings with individuals within the community and with those community organizations. And so how do you kind of start to create a policy or kind of modify a policy? Is it almost like you're kind of grouping some issues together that you're finding, or how does all of that work?
Yeah, so there's like so many different, kind of ways to approach it. And so I'll give you some kind of examples tied to policies that we're currently focusing on. So private probation is a big policy priority area for us in the coalition. Private probation is something that's utilized in Missouri. Only a handful of states use this. And basically it's private companies entering into agreements with county courts and being utilized as private probation providers for misdemeanor probation. So you can't use it for felony probation. If you're on felony probation in Missouri, you have to have, you're on probation with the state. But if you have a misdemeanor charge and you're going on probation for that, and your county elects to work with one of these outside private providers, they also call it offender-funded probation, because the supervision fees, all of the cost requirements go directly onto the person on supervision. And so we're talking about misdemeanor charges. Misdemeanor probation, in my opinion, should not be a super high hurdle for someone to be able to successfully complete. That seems to be kind of counterproductive to the goal of helping somebody move forward with their lives. But what we see with private probation is that it's very expensive. There's not really any rhyme or reason to the fines and fees that somebody can have levied against them. They can be required to go to like anger management classes, parenting classes, having to get, UA drug testing done on a regular basis, even if those things don't actually, have any impact on their specific charge. So, for example, they could have a traffic related charge that they're on probation for, and they're having to take, biweekly UA testing. When I was working at one of my previous roles, I worked for the Bail Project for some time. I was a bail disruptor in St. Charles County, which is a very wealthy county on the kind of the outskirts of the St. Louis area. And I had a lot of clients that I was helping, post bond for and help them in coming back to court. And they would really frequently have that drug test requirement where, they were like, how am I going to get to where this drug testing provider is? It's like $30, each time. And these are people that, are struggling to keep their jobs because they just got put in jail on, a failure to appear for not being able to make it to court. So, that's a different tangent. But with private probation, we're very much kind of in the research phase. There's not a ton of research that's been done on like how prevalent this issue is in Missouri, how counties are utilizing it, what are the alternatives. We don't really want to just go in guns blazing on an issue if we don't have a really clear idea of, what are we proposing in its stead. And so over the last year, we've been working to really gather a lot of that information. We've done like a county level survey and reached out to, clerks and judges in all the different counties and circuit courts throughout the state to try to, gain a better understanding of how widely this practice is being used. And kind of how courts are utilizing it. The legislation that's been filed on this issue is kind of just starting to chip away at the issue. So there's been legislation filed in both the House and the Senate this year, both by Republican sponsors, which in Missouri, that's how we got to get stuff done. And thankfully, criminal legal reform right now is a very bipartisan issue. There's, a lot of splits in our country politically on a lot of different things, but people are really coming together to work forward on some of these issues because it just makes sense. And people see that, the system that we have right now is not sustainable for many, many reasons. So that's an example where we're very much in the research phase still, but we still, have some legislation that we're supporting and trying to push forward that would minimize the amount of time that someone can be on misdemeanor probation from 2 years to 1.5 years. It would limit the use of UA testing to only individuals with a current drug charge. So just, some examples of those policies are starting to kind of try to rein in the system, but as we do more research, as we do more community education on the issue, we'll, in the next couple of sessions be trying to introduce stronger language on that. What we're ultimately hoping to push for is elimination of private probation in Missouri altogether. But if we were to file, a policy, a bill on that this year, it would definitely not have gone anywhere, because there's not that, there hasn't been that conversation in the legislature. People don't even know what private probation is. Another example of, kind of a policy that we're in a very different phase with is the Clean Slate campaign, which I'll talk a lot about on the show today, because it's one of the most singular impactful policies for reentry. And it's a policy that would automate the expungement process in Missouri. Currently, we have a petition-based system, which means that you have to be aware that you are eligible for criminal record sealing. You have to jump through a lot of hoops. It's very expensive, it's time-consuming. You have to go back to the county of origin, wherever the offense occurred. You have to pay like at least $500 just in fines and fees, and then on top of that, retain an attorney. So as you can imagine, for the people that need it most, it is not an accessible process. There's over 500,000 Missourians that have a current record that's eligible for expungement, which in Missouri, when we say expungement, we mean record sealing, which means that like law enforcement and the courts still have ultimate access to your records. It's not like they've been fully destroyed, but a private background check wouldn't be able to see that record. And that's where it's most impactful, and people are really being held back in these private background checks. And so that's an example of a policy that, there's a big national push for Clean Slate. The Clean Slate Initiative is our national campaign partner. They've run successful Clean Slate campaigns and gotten Clean Slate legislation passed in 10 states now. And so, we've got a lot to go off of. We worked on creating a very comprehensive policy with partners at UMKC. UMKC runs an expungement law clinic, so they are very well versed on Missouri's current expungement policy and practice and kind of how that process works. And they held like a series of community meetings to get input from folks as we were working on that piece of legislation. And that's, something that it's gone pretty far in its first session of being introduced, but it's definitely going to be a multi-year push. And kind of everything in between. There's a lot of policies where, we have an example of what a policy looks like for another state, and we're trying to craft that into something that would work well in Missouri and be palatable to Missouri legislators and the Missouri public. There's a lot of areas where, we are still in that research phase, figuring out, how do you translate this issue into something with an effective policy solution. One policy issue that the coalition is very focused on, and we're going to be in working groups this summer trying to raise awareness on the issue, talk to legislators about the issue, and really hopefully find some Republican champions to take the issue on, is the establishment of a DOC oversight committee. So currently there's no like external accountability arm of the Department of Corrections in our state. And, this is something that, there's external accountability for, museum districts and zoos and schools, and just all of these different public works have some kind of external accountability. But, these departments of correction that are tasked with, incarcerating and keeping away from the rest of society, thousands and thousands of our state residents don't have that same external accountability. The last couple of years, there's been, DOC oversight legislation introduced, but it's always been introduced by Democratic legislators, and unfortunately has never really gotten off the ground. So that's an example of something we see as a really clear solution. We know that it's going to be like a pretty big fight to get any kind of DOC oversight legislation passed. But one of the reasons that I think it's so important is because a lot of the issues that people that are currently incarcerated are facing are issues that if you try to address them through specific policies, you're always going to be like years behind, because you're trying to respond to things that egregious human rights violation conditions that 3 years later maybe you'll get a policy that's focused on that specific issue. But having DOC oversight is one just one policy that would be a really effective way to help people that are currently incarcerated and their families have somewhere to turn to have some kind of external accountability and assistance. There's a lot of issues for people in Missouri prisons right now around access to quality healthcare, quality food. There's been a lot of issues with mail policy. So there's just a lot of things that, to try to piecemeal address them through the legislation is going to take so long to have this one kind of overarching policy that would help kind of that internal process of addressing all of those many injustices is still, obviously a very big push to try to get Missouri to a spot where, we're ready for DOC oversight. But so hopefully, some of those examples just kind of helps. There's a lot of different approaches that work in the policy space, and, depending on the issue, depending on where people in the legislature are at on an issue, it really kind of, that is what dictates what your approach is going to be to it.
Awesome.
There's some issues that we kind of like stay back on, and stuff will get like buried in other bills. And, for example, there's a really great public benefits cliff bill that has a really key piece of language that would remove the SNAP felony drug ban from currently in Missouri. If you have drug felonies on your record, you're ineligible from receiving SNAP. They tried to change this a couple of years ago legislatively, and there was still some red tape in the language that had been overlooked. And so it's being included in this larger public benefits package, but we're not really highlighting it. It's an issue that we're like, okay, the sponsor of the bill is very much, she's on board with it, but, kind of to get it by other people, it has not been an issue that we talk about. So sometimes advocacy means, knowing when to kind of be silent on an issue and let other issues kind of be the carrier for that bill. So yeah, there's lots of different strategies. I'm still, like I said, very new to the policy space. So I have been learning so much. This first session has been, I feel like I'm back in school myself.
For sure, it does. It sounds like there's a lot of components that go into that creation of those policies.
Yeah.
And so do you know how long it takes kind of like from beginning to the finalized creation or stage of a policy? Do you know how long that takes?
Yeah, so I heard Representative Ashley Bland Manlove was speaking to an advocacy day group that I was in attendance of a couple of weeks ago, and she was saying to the group that on average it can take 7 years for a policy from its like initial introduction to its ultimate passage. It can take up to 7 years for that to happen. And we know, for a lot of policies, obviously it never happens. I think that things do really have to be, either priorities for leadership or priorities for people that, have a lot of power in either chamber. So, there's a lot of really great policies that get filed every year in Missouri on, really kind of things that would move us way forward in what we're fighting for in the criminal legal system. But, we're still 5 years away from those policies being taken seriously. And so sometimes it's about, who introduces it. Sometimes it's about like the messaging and, just the timing of things. Like this session has been a difficult session for criminal legal issues because there's been a lot of distraction on issues of local control in Missouri. They have introduced a lot of bills seeking to take local control of the St. Louis Metro Police Department back into the hands of the state. This is something that Kansas City has been dealing with for a long time, and has really come from some fear mongering in the legislature around like defund the police and ideas that I think people don't like fully understand. But obviously we believe that cities and localities should maintain local control of their whole criminal legal public safety budgets and be able to make those decisions for themselves. For I'm a St. Louis City resident. I really don't want the state dictating how much money we're giving our police department versus our education system, our public works system, social service programs to help divert people from the criminal legal system. There's also another bill that's been very focused on establishing a special prosecutor in the city of St. Louis and trying to oust our current circuit attorney. So those issues have kind of taken like the front seat of the criminal legal focus for the 2023 legislative session in Missouri, and have made it, kind of hard to get other things talked about, because that's what people want to be talking about. And those, are not issues that we see as things that are going to move us forward, and rather, things that I think could set us back quite a ways to remove local control in these key areas. But we can't decide what people are fired up about going into session. And so sometimes, you might have a lot of community momentum for an issue, but it's just, the bill never gets a hearing. And so it's like, you gotta try to keep that momentum going and figure out what you can do in between the end of session in May and the beginning of next session in January to make this enough of a priority for, some folks in the legislature that it can actually get a fair shot.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like you guys are like waiting and just waiting patiently for that change. But then again, there are all those distractions that are just kind of prolonging that, just closing that gap almost to justice.
Yeah.
Like we just want to get closer, but again, dealing with those distractions.
Yeah, absolutely. You have to celebrate like every small win.
For sure. And so what are some of the policies that promote reentry processes for individuals?
Yeah, so I mentioned clean slate. I think clean slate would be like the single most kind of impactful reentry related policy that we've been talking to people about, because the collateral consequences of a record are so great. There's nearly 50,000 different state and federal regulatory restrictions that limit people with records. Things from, accessing employment, accessing occupational licensing, being able to be a chaperone on your kid's field trip, being able to serve on a jury, being able to go to law school, all of these things a criminal record can keep you from in our state. And background checks is a really key area where people are being held back. 2 in 3 colleges, almost 9 in 10 employers, and 8 out of 10 landlords use private background checks. And like I said, on paper, Missouri has a really great petition-based expungement process. There's actually a relatively large number of offenses that can qualify for record sealing. And the waiting periods, the number of years that you have to wait for your records to be able to be sealed is relatively short compared to a lot of states. But the process is so time-consuming, confusing, and expensive that it keeps many people from being able to access it. Like I said, less than 1% of Missourians that qualify for record sealing have actually been able to access it. If I've worked in a lot of different, program management. If I ever had a program that had like a less than 1% success rate, I would definitely want to go back to the drawing board and figure out a different way to approach the program, because it's clearly not working at the current clearance rates for people's criminal records. Getting expungements, it would take 1,000 years at those same rates just to clear the number of people that are currently eligible for record sealing in our state. And the ways that people are held back with a record, it costs everybody, right? It costs that individual, it costs their family, it costs their kids, not being able to, have their parent be able to have upward mobility in a company, or get into the field or the sector that they want. We had a hearing on the House Clean Slate bill, which is Missouri House Bill 352. We had a hearing a couple weeks ago, and we had advocates share some really powerful testimony. And one of a key person on our Clean Slate campaign was talking about his experience trying to get a job with a record and, coming on at a temp agency. And as soon as he hit kind of the 90-day mark, they would be like, okay, we can't take you on, permanently because of this record. So thanks for your time. Bye. Even though he was doing a really great job. Those are just, some of the myriad of ways that people are being held back. We know that folks with a record are only half as likely to get a call back from a potential employer as other job seekers. And nearly 50% of kids in the US have a parent with a record. So it's definitely something that, even if someone's like, oh, you did the crime, this is, your punishment, which I think when we talk about, the punishments levied by the criminal legal system, we really don't talk about collateral consequences the way that we should be, because it's a perpetual punishment that it's not written there in the criminal code, but the reality of the way people are treated in our society, the lasting impact of a record, the overuse of these background checks, and the many specific restrictions that are on the books that ban people from being able to just participate in society to the fullest. All of those things really hinder the reentry process. Prior to coming to Empower Missouri, I worked for an organization in St. Louis for several years called CJM, Criminal Justice Ministry, that does a lot of reentry housing, working specifically with folks that have served really long prison sentences. So people coming home after, 10, 15, 20 years. And the hoops that we expect people to be able to jump through in their first couple of weeks outside of prison are, if anyone, that's making the policies really was in that position, trying to learn how to use a phone when you've maybe never seen a smartphone before, trying to learn to navigate a bus schedule in a city that probably looks very different than it did the last time that you were out, having to go to all of these interviews and deal with a lot of doors shut in your face before you get, any kind of entry or chance taken on you. All of those things can be really damaging to somebody's spirit, let alone just the actual reality of trying to navigate all of those things, trying to stay in compliance with your parole, trying to work on repairing, your social relationships, trying to deal with the institutionalization of incarceration. It really is a traumatic experience, incarceration, and I think that the reentry process has to be healing, right? We have to acknowledge that it's incarceration is trauma, and unfortunately, the reentry process is for most people, not very supportive. In Missouri DOC, despite the best efforts of some individual staff members, they are really understaffed, and the reentry process for folks, that pre-release planning really often does not happen. And so folks are, ending up back in the community sometimes with no, safe or stable place to live, with, very limited opportunities in terms of employment. And, it's really difficult for people to not end up back in prison. I mean, the odds are really stacked against people. Missouri kind of leads the country. I don't know if we're exactly number one, but we're in the top couple states for technical parole violations. So people going back to prison, continuing to bloat our already very, very high prison population because of things that would not be illegal for you or I, for people not on parole. Things like, not checking in with your PO, or, going, in a part of the state that you're not supposed to go in, staying with a family member that might have, somebody else that's currently on supervision staying there. All of these things can be the reason that somebody ends up back in prison, not because they committed a new crime, and they end up back in prison, spending the rest of the years on their sentence. That's just, I think it shows you where we're at as a state in supporting people in the reentry process, which is to say we're not doing a great job. A lot of it goes to social service organizations trying to help people navigate this. But, I'm based in St. Louis. We've got a lot of, great reentry organizations in St. Louis, and we still can't meet the demand. I think same goes in Kansas City. There's a lot of great organizations doing, on the ground work with folks coming home from prison and from jail. But we still can't meet the demand. But if you live in a more rural or remote part of the state, you're like SOL a lot of times. There's just not programs available for people, or they're faith-based programs. They're programs that you have to really follow a lot of rules, or they're substance use focused when, not everybody's coming out, identifying as, somebody that wants to be in recovery. So clean slate, helping people move past the barriers of a criminal record, I think is one of the most impactful ways, but also really supporting people in that pre-release process by making sure that they have their ID, their social security card, these vital documents that are really necessary for getting a job, getting housing, all of that. Getting people, enrolled in Medicaid before they come out of prison. Helping, fund and support these organizations and community-based work that's happening to try to help people get back on their feet when they're back in the community. Those are some of the many ways that we could be doing a better job of supporting people going through reentry. There's a couple exciting bills too that I just want to mention. One that has been passed out of the House that would restore felony voting rights for people while they're still on supervision. So right now in Missouri, if you have a felony, you can vote again, but you have to wait until you're fully off of supervision. So there's a couple different pieces of legislation that have been filed that would restore those voting rights as soon as somebody's out and on supervision. So yeah, I think that reentry is a very challenging time period for people. It's a really critical time period because it can be, the time when someone's able to successfully break away from the criminal legal system and, move forward and have a, full life and not be pulled back into that. But more often than not, we see people end up in this vicious cycle because they're set up to fail.
Right. It definitely sounds like the legal system makes it too easy to go back in as compared to it should be kind of flipped to where it should be extremely hard to go back in because the legal system should want it to be easy to stay out.
Yes,
but that's
absolutely
obviously not the case. And so we've got a couple more minutes and then we'll open it up for any questions coming through the social media. But I guess the last question is, what policies are Empower working on currently?
Yeah, so I mentioned clean slate, which again has been a big focus of ours. There's also some. I'm trying to give you answers of things that have gotten movement and traction in this current session, because there's a lot of things that we support, but they're not going anywhere right now.
Right.
So the establishment of diversion programs through the state and not just up to the discretion of individual county courts is something that we are really prioritizing. There's been a couple pieces of legislation filed in the House and the Senate that would establish statewide DWI diversion programs. And so those are things that we're really excited about. There's been a number of bills this year filed. I don't know if any of them are going to make it across the finish line, but that focus on the issue of wrongful incarceration and increasing the amount of compensation that we offer for people that have been wrongfully incarcerated, establishing a conviction review unit that would be a state-funded group that would focus on, looking at old convictions that people have reason to think are not valid, and really, try to eliminate as many, wrongful convictions as we can, because it's the more that you learn about wrongful convictions, it's very disturbing. There are a lot of people in prison that did not do the crime that they have been charged with and have very little recourse to try to address it. There's also a bill that was filed this year that would eliminate. Missouri has the second highest crack cocaine, powder cocaine sentencing disparity in the country. We're one of only 8 states that still has this disparity on the books at all, and the federal government, and it's 18.75 to 1. So if you had the same amount of crack cocaine to powder cocaine, your sentence being caught in possession of crack cocaine would be almost 19 times harsher than your sentence for the exact same amount of powder cocaine. We know this is, based in racism, based in very flawed understanding of how these drugs work, because they are chemically identical. And so we're excited about where that's going. That has been amended onto some language of a bill that's passed the House and is over for consideration in the Senate right now. So yeah, those are a couple pieces of legislation that have been moving this year.
For sure. It definitely is tough to battle against the system in which racism was essentially built into. And so it does sound like you guys are actually really trying to tackle those issues and kind of create that equity and equality for individuals within Missouri. And so that's really awesome.
Yeah.
And so it's 10:45, so I will open it up to the social media team to grab any questions off of Facebook, Instagram, that any of the viewers have had.
Erica, Kwanda, if you all are ready, we're ready for Q&A. 10:45 mark. There we go.
All right. So we have a lot of questions. It's been some good discussion on social media. So the first question I'll say is, do you find technical violations are higher with private probation companies?
That's a great question. So technical violations on probation are a little bit different than parole. Parole is like you've had a charge, you've gone to prison, you've been serving the time. Probation's like a suspended imposition of sentence, I think is what they call it. So you're trying to stay in compliance with probation to avoid a potential term of incarceration. But what we see with private probation is that a lot of people are not able to stay in compliance with their probation requirements, which kind of, is, you're basically saying the same thing there, because they can't afford the fines and fees and they're afraid of being locked up. And so they skip out on their meetings with their PO, they skip out on their court date. And it looks like, oh, this person's, doesn't want to successfully complete their probation. It's actually just that they can't afford to. They don't want to be thrown back in jail. And so, yeah, it's criminalization of poverty at its finest. Private probation is a really, it's an interesting topic. I encourage folks to do some reading because the more you learn about it, the madder you will get.
That sounds very accurate from just, this is, I think, the first time I've heard about it, and I definitely had that reaction to it. Another question along the same lines is, are these contracts, the private probation contracts, publicized to the general public, or are people not really aware?
If I wanted to start a private probation company, I would just have to, draw up a little business, not even a business plan. I would just have to convince a Missouri County court to work with me. There are no regulations. There's no state database. We have been trying to pull that together in our survey. So we know that there's like a lot of these companies are only serving like 1 or 2 counties. So there's like, hundreds of these agencies. We don't have an exact count. I think the names that we have of specific places is maybe more like around 20. But there's a lot of counties that, didn't answer our survey or didn't give us names of the places that they work with. So yeah, there's no regulations, no internal tracking system, no way to see, are these companies, hiring people that are qualified? Are they using evidence-based practice? That's not in the conversation at all. And so that's one of the big issues with private probation is if you're going to be, forcing people to pay for this service and you can't even, guarantee that the private probation contractors have been vetted. I think, one of the reasons that it has taken off in Missouri is because it's really appealing to counties that, might not have a big, budget to work with. This is a way that they can keep a bunch of people on, misdemeanor probation. I think one of the things that we talk about as a solution to private probation is just, we don't need to have all these people on misdemeanor probation, or they can be, on bench probation, which basically just means that, every now and then you're going in and checking in, you're just staying out of trouble. It's not like this same, monthly supervisions, all these classes. So I think this is an example of like a problem that I feel like the solution is just like, maybe we need to rethink how we do this and why we're putting so many people on misdemeanor probation. Is this actually having outcomes that help people? I think most of the data speaks to the opposite, and especially with private probation, because it's really difficult for people to successfully complete it if they don't have a lot of money.
So can I interrupt for a minute? Now, I'm shocked. No regulations, no database, no internal tracking. Anybody can just say, I want to start a probation company.
Yeah, if the
No
county
vetting.
agrees to work with you, yeah.
And okay, I'm sorry.
I told you get mad the more you learn about it. It's really messed up.
Okay, because I'm thinking, all right, there's got to be some kind of RFP proposal process, contracting something, and it's publicized. And I'm like, well, if there is, then how come I don't know about it and others don't know about it? Maybe if in fact this is needed, we maybe need to flip the tide on who is providing those services and need to be culturally responsive to communities, and okay.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, this is new to me. Like it's new to you.
I'll send you some good reading on the issue. There's
Okay,
some
please
good
do.
research
Please
that,
do.
yeah.
Because herein lies the problem. Yeah, herein lies the problem with the technical violations, sending folks back. Okay, go ahead, Eric. This is amazing.
It's very alarming. It's alarming. Another question was, how difficult has it been to achieve bipartisan support on some of these justice reform bills?
I have been, I would say, like, pleasantly surprised. I didn't, like I said, this is a new position for me in policy, and in a lot of the community-based work I've done, I would have not expected to find so many allies in the Missouri legislature. But that's definitely not to say that it's been easy. There's, working with folks across the aisle. There's people that, are coming from, a very community-based, grassroots, progressive lens that, we work with in advocacy spaces that will get upset because you're working with a legislator that, just does not see eye to eye on a lot of issues. But, we see eye to eye on this one specific criminal legal issue. And so they want to sponsor this bill for us, but they have, very different policies in a lot of other spaces. And so, I'm very much of the attitude that, like, I will work with anybody, and I don't really care what their motivation is or like what is bringing them to the table. I think fiscal conservatism is what has gotten a lot of people to finally care about criminal legal issues. It's financially unsustainable for states to keep up, the speed of mass incarceration as we currently have it. And I'm like, personally, I'm like, whatever brings you to the table, I'm just focused on, let's try to work together. And so there's a lot of times where I have to take my personal opinions out of the equation. Personally, I identify as an abolitionist. Everything that I do is kind of with an abolitionist lens. But professionally in my space, I'm not leading coalition meetings talking about defund the police or abolitionism. It informs everything that I do, but you also have to work with everybody where they're at. And respect, the perspectives that other people are bringing, which are varied. Yeah, I think there is a lot of bipartisan support.
That's great, and that gives us a good segue to the next question, talking about the financial burden. What is the cost to seek expungement in Missouri?
So it's about $500 just in the fines and fees, but then you also have to retain an attorney unless you find somebody that can do it pro bono, or you get assistance through a clinic, which there are some clinics. I mentioned like UMKC has an expungement law clinic. There's it's called a Clean Slate Clinic in Springfield, Missouri, that has helped process a lot of people's expungements. So unless you have that like pro bono clinic route, you're looking at thousands of dollars. And another thing that I neglected to mention earlier when we were talking about expungements is that currently in Missouri, you can only get one felony expunged. It has to be an eligible felony. There's a lot of felonies that are not eligible. So like any violent felony is not going to be eligible for expungement. But anything else, you can only have one felony sealed from your record, and I think currently it's 2 misdemeanors. In our legislative language, we've proposed increasing that cap to 3 felonies and 5 misdemeanors. Because, you know, that doesn't look like anybody's criminal record. Very few people have like a single felony on their record. And so for a lot of people, you know, currently, even if they have the means to pursue record sealing, if they have, you know, more criminal records than would be sealed, it's like not worth it for them to go through all of that just to remove, you know, one charge from their record.
And then the next question was, do we know, is there like an estimate of how many people? Because I know you mentioned it would take 1,000 years at the rate that we're moving right now, but do we have an idea of the number of people that would be eligible for expungement?
Yeah, so right now in Missouri, there's 518,000 people that have a criminal record that currently qualifies for record sealing, that it's, you know, still on there. And that number grows every year as more people become eligible because they've met the waiting period. So it's not a static number.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. And so this question, I'm going to read it. That says there's a laundry list of affinity employers who made a pledge during Obama era administration to support and or provide employment opportunities for individuals formerly incarcerated. And the question follows up with, where are they now? And does the coalition have engagement with any of these affinity employers?
That's a great question. I think especially with the Clean Slate campaign, the business community has been a really, really big part of that, especially some of these like large second chance employers. They're very much in support of Clean Slate. We also have like a lot of business chambers, chambers of commerce from various cities that have signed on in support of Clean Slate. In terms of the coalition, there's not as many people that are kind of coming from that business background that are currently engaged in our coalition, which I mean, I would love to change. I think that this is very much something that, you know, business owners, larger employers, you know, especially those that have already made a promise towards working on second chance hiring. It's definitely a space that we love working with employers and would love to work with more people in the advocacy space.
And we should note, this is Second Chance Month.
Yes, it is. Yes, thank you, Elaine. I should have shouted that out. Yes,
Okay.
April is Second Chance
Yeah,
Month.
Second Chance Month. Go ahead, Eric, any other questions?
I think I missed one, so I'm just kind of going through slowly. Oh, okay. Is there any effort to the need for the Department of Corrections oversight and publishing impact stories? Has that been something, any policy around that?
I would say that not necessarily a policy around publishing impact stories, but I do want to take a second to point folks towards, I will drop this in the chat as soon as I find their website. There's a group called Missouri Prison Reform that they have a Twitter account, they have an Instagram account. It's run by a woman named Lori Curry, who's just really amazing. She's just a single person doing this advocacy work. And she has a direct line. I can't find their website right now, so I'm just dropping her Twitter account link. But she has a direct line to a lot of people that are currently incarcerated. And there's, you know, correctional officers that talk to her too. So that Twitter account, that Instagram account is a really great one to subscribe to and see, you know, stories from people that are currently incarcerated that are saying, hey, you know, this person just died at our facility. It's very suspicious. They're not telling us about it. You know, can you get the word out? And that's what Lori does, is she, you know, brings attention to things that are currently happening inside facilities. And it's the DOC really does not like her. And it's a very tricky, you know, thing to do. Information control in prisons is huge. And so getting the stories of people, you know, that are currently incarcerated out is extremely important and also very difficult.
Yeah, it is. And you know, that is so interesting. I was on my Twitter account last night, and her posting was on my feed about all of the things that's going on inside of DOC and folks complaining about access to healthcare, medical treatment, all of that kind of good stuff. And I promptly typed to her, contact the ACLU of Missouri. We're looking for complaints, okay? Because we operate, and this is, as I said, separate from my show, but the reality is this. It takes a lot of manpower and resources to do individual complaints. So we look at things systemically. So we're looking for patterns of practice. And if we don't know about it, we can't do anything. And if she's got that kind of inroads and folks calling her, we need to know about that, you know? Yeah, absolutely. I'm gonna reach out to Lori. I plan to reach out to her. It's interesting you brought her up.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I'm happy to like help with that connection.
Please, All right, Erica, is that about it?
Yeah, that was all of our questions.
Okay, excellent. Okay, great. Wonderful feedback, Gwen. And this has been really informative. I've learned quite a bit about, I know a lot about the rates of recidivism because of technical violations and all of that stuff. But I knew a lot of that stuff from the federal and national level because that's where I previously often worked. Mm-hmm. But at the state level, it's like Missouri is egregious on a lot of things.
We are.
Oh my gosh. You have to wonder, it was the last holdover state from slavery and all of these impacted issue areas that seem to emanate from that. It's really, it's something that we got to continue to keep a watch on and continue to promote very strong advocacy options and issues, especially in the policy arena, because everything cannot be litigated. At some level, we need to be looking at changing policies, and that's what you guys are doing and doing very effectively. Yeah. So, Lainey, I'm going to turn it back over to you. We're at our 11 o'clock hour.
Thank you, Gwen, so much for being able to share policies that help promote and policies that do hinder the reentry process for individuals, especially ones within that poverty area. And thank you for the work that Empower Missouri does, because it's needed, it's wanted by much of society. And so we appreciate any and all of the work that you are doing there. And congratulations on this newer position. And we hope all goes well with that.
Thank you so much. And if I can just plug really quick, I should have done this earlier, but I can drop them in just our Zoom link chat if you guys can share them with folks out. So the first thing I'm putting is the link to our Community Justice Coalition sign up. If anyone is interested in the coalition is open to everybody. You don't actually even have to be a member to attend our Zoom meetings, but I would urge you to, if you are interested in being a member, putting your email there, signing up. I will schedule some time to chat with you and bring you up to speed on what we're focused on in the coalition. The second thing I'm putting in the chat is our Missouri Clean Slate website, where you can sign up to stay updated on the Clean Slate campaign. And you can also sign up to put your name in support of Clean Slate and bringing automatic expungement to Missouri.
Awesome. That's great. Okay, excellent. I'm glad you gave it. Erica, did you capture that? I'm putting it on Facebook. Okay, awesome.
Thank you.
Great. Well, this has been wonderful. And again, thank you so very much. This is our last episode for season 6. We're going to go on our summer hiatus where we actually start all of our planning for season 7 and doing some of our cleanup work, getting everything up on YouTube and all that kind of good stuff from both shows. So next Saturday, the Just Us Youth show will be on with their last episode for their season 1, because they just launched in January, and that show is focused on juvenile justice issues. So we thank you so much for joining us. And Gwen, you're going to hang around with us. We'll be back at 11:15 for our Maximizing the Moment segment with our interns. Okay. All right.
Thank you so much for having me. This is great.
Absolutely enjoyed it. We'll listen. We got to bring you back because I'd like for you to kind of inform us from a policy perspective, because there are family members and friends who have someone that's been incarcerated or is currently incarcerated, that we focus on also getting information to relevant and timely information. And we'd love to have you come back frequently just to kind of keep the policy information going and keeping folks informed. Okay.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah, sounds good. All right. So once again, thank you for joining us for our last installment of season 6 We will actually return to you as the Justice Beat Talk Show in October 2023. And next Saturday, we will have the Just Us Youth Talk Show on board for their last episode of their kickoff season 1. Again, thank you so much. God bless and take care.